I got a message, somebody saying they can't hear me. Jacqueline, can?
Yes, I can.
Okay, let's make sure everyone can hear us transmitting from down here in Mexico. Okay. So David, sorry, I'm not sure what's going on with your feed there, but it seems like it's working okay. This is Jeremy Martin, and I'm delighted to be gathered around the table here in Mexico City on December 6th, the day after the Deepwater auction. And I'm joined by Jason Fargo, who's the Latin America team leader at Energy Intelligence Group. Jason, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And also Alejandra Leon, who's the director for Latin America Upstream at IHS Markit. Alejandra, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy.
And I have to say, this is the first time we've ever tried this. We're gathered around my laptop live from Mexico doing a webinar discussion, a sort of rapid reaction Deepwater auction. Real quickly, a couple of notes. This will largely hopefully be a conversation. I'm going to just run through a couple of slides to recap where we are this morning, and then Jason and Alejandro will all make some comments. They'll have some of their key takeaways and thoughts based upon yesterday, going forward, and where we stand in Mexico. But get to questions, so we're going to try and move through our comments fairly quickly. And the questions are delivered via the chat function for those of you who've joined us before. Just on the chat function right there, type a question in, and it should appear right there on the screen. I will read those out loud, and we'll take as many of those questions as we can get to before 12 o'clock Mexico City time. So let me just quickly run through some slides to set up where we are, and obviously I think most of this call are no stranger to the fact that Mexico, it's the largest oil world. It's an important player, but it's also been for almost 80 years off the table, and has long been an accessible market for private international oil companies. Obviously, one of the reasons we're gathered here after yesterday's historic auction is the changes that were necessitated by the fact that and the nation's energy sector writ large has not been meeting the needs of the nation's population. Part of that not at Pemex, from a peak of 3.4 million barrels a day in 2004 to around 2.1 million barrels today, and unfortunately sliding toward the million mark, if not below, in the coming years. So that leads us to, obviously, the famous 2013 energy reform constitutional amendment put forth by the Peña Nieto government, and specifically to what most people in the energy reform on the oil and gas side had been expecting, and the anticipation in building in what many take to call the nation's crown jewels, and that's the Deepwater, and that was the auction that happened yesterday. So just real quickly, 10 blocks were auctioned by the CNH yesterday. There's a map there. It's not the best. I'm sure everyone has seen this by now. 2 different areas were put forth. The Perdido Fold is Salina Basin, or in the Perdido Fold, 6 in the Salina Basin. Round 1, yesterday was 4th auction of round 1. It completed round 1, which was the multi-phase bid round launched in 2014 upon the energy reform secondary legislation. The blocks were tendered yesterday with license contracts, similar to what most people know as in the oil and gas world as concessions. In addition to the 10 blocks, we're going to get into a little bit the Trion project. And I'm not going to read the text here, but I think most of you are aware of the fact that the Trion project, the first farm out, the thing about the Trion project is it wasn't part of this 1.4 round or this auction when it was originally conceived. Instead, it was added to this lineup only in July, 7 months after the Deepwater auction was formally launched. In addition to the timing, the process, and the way the farm-out had been developed in Mexico had led to a lot of question marks. Nevertheless, Australia's BHP Billiton won the competition with BP yesterday to partner with Trion. And the final point on this is I think we're all going to talk about how the Trion partnership mix will be a test for the new industry dynamics in Mexico. Just to recap, at the end, after several months of qualification and a rigorous qualification process, 15 bidders emerged with the opportunity to submit bids yesterday. The 15 were comprised of both individual companies and consortia. And we all, at this point, probably are quite aware of the winners. There were 9 all in told, and 8 blocks out of the 10 in the original Deepwater auction, and the Trion partnership with Pemex. China, France, the United States, Japan, Norway, the UK, Malaysia. There was a real global diversity, and in fact, the Energy Secretary, in his press conference after the round, went through percentages and talked about how the percentages of American companies was 25%, the European companies was, I forget the exact number, but anyway, he was so emphatic on the geographical diversity of these winners of the auction yesterday. So that's the recap. I wanted to stop there and turn it over to Jason Erst to share some of his thoughts and insights. And I want to also thank Jason for support on the document that we produced, a curtain raising document we put out last fall, Mexico's Big Moment. Jason.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. I think the first point that I would just make is perhaps somewhat obvious, but I think it bears stating, and that is that this is a really, really successful auction result. The Mexican government is thrilled. I would say, this definitely on sort of the high end of the best case scenario. For the Mexican government, it sort of hits a lot of their main objectives in this whole process. Not just from the auction, but also for the energy reform more broadly. In the first place, they awarded most of the blocks, which is always good. Some of the blocks had multiple bids, so that adds to the sense that Mexico is an attractive place for international oil investment. Critically, it attracted the international majors, and that's important for 2 reasons. One, frankly, the only companies that can actually handle the Deepwater from the technical and financial side of things are the international majors, but it also gives sort of an industry seal of approval, if you will, to Mexico as a place to invest in the oil and gas sector. You have very sophisticated companies, very big companies, and they're sort of giving their imprimatur, if you will, to Mexico as a place to invest. And I think that is very heartening to Peña Nieto and to the government. Interestingly, and Jeremy alluded to this just now, there's a pretty broad geographical diversity of winners, and I think that that's interesting. The Mexicans expressed in the press conference after yesterday's results, sort of expressed pleasure. There was a mix of geographic representation, and I think that maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but I don't think so. I think the fact that it isn't just American-based multinationals could help sell this process to a Mexican public that is often skeptical, American corporate intention, perhaps more so at the current moment. And the presence of Sierra Oil and Gas as a local, recently formed Mexican independent, I think that's an interesting takeaway as well. That you have now a private Mexican company that took stakes in blocks and is actually going to be involved in deepwater drilling. So I think that helps fulfill the stated objective in the auction of building up a private Mexican sector of independence, which was one of the stated goals of the reform. It's difficult to do in a country where for almost 80 years, as you pointed out, it's just been the Pemex show. And just one last point that I'll make right now is that the fact that they were able to unload Trion is a huge deal, both for the government, but also for Pemex. Had they not done that, it would have been a political problem for Peña Nieto. It would have been sort of viewed as a slap in the face, to the viability of Pemex and perhaps the entire. It also would have posed a substantial problem for Pemex and its investment plan, its plan, because they are really relying on new cash coming in from these partnerships. They're relying on new technology and technology transfer from their partners to enable them to boost production over the long term, and had they not been able to, where Pemex is going. So I think that there is a critical element to the success story. And even yesterday morning, at 7, 8 o'clock, people from the government that I saw in the hall were sort of, we're a little bit nervous about Prion. Everything else we're okay with. But you could see that as concern. And then once the auction results came in for Prion to be off the BHP, it's just everybody got a lot more relaxed.
Yeah, I mean, we could, case in point, I sort of flew by it, but if you look at that photo, and Jose Antonio Gonzalez Anaya, the CEO of Pemex, of course, conferring, and there are a couple of happy campers for sure. Thank you so much, Jason. Alejandra Leon, thank you. Look forward to your insights.
Thank you, Jeremy and Jason. I couldn't be more agreed with your comments. Certainly, I'm happy also. I'm part of this. Implications are even deeper than what just critical I think, to prove really how attractive is Mexico, how to materialize really this reform, and of course to create the foundations for keeping this reform in the good path for the next administrations also. So certainly.
I'm sorry, hold on one second, Alejandra. I just want to make sure we're having a little bit of a problem with the audio here. Maybe we should switch to the phone bridge here. And see if that's not a bit better. So let's.
Okay, could you hear me? Okay. So I was saying that really what happened yesterday is a good foundation for the reform for future administrations, and it's really creating the certainty that this country needs. Deepwater, I need to remember that is a very critical auction, because this is where the big hopes are in Mexico about how to revert the decline in production in this country, and of course the huge implications for government budget. So certainly it's really a good step. I need to say that of course it's still to be proved, to materialize when investments start coming in, but it's undoubtable. I mean, it's certainly that Pemex alone shouldn't be able to run so many projects at the same time at the magnitude of technological challenges that is Deepwater. Pemex alone couldn't have really the estimating $2 to $5 billion that we are expecting an investment in the following 5 years. So certainly it's very positive. It's still a lot of concerns in some other areas. This reform is really an integrated reform, so part of the success or part of the challenges for these auctions, or the results of these auctions, is how the rest of the reform continue moving forward. So we are talking about infrastructure development, we are talking about security things, we are talking about plumbing auctions, and we are talking even for environmental and security regulations, capabilities for CNH still to handling and administrate all these contracts, capabilities for the petroleum fund to continue receiving and administrating the resources for the government. We are still pending for a new trader for the government in order to trade the benefits of these contracts, etc. So it's still a lot of things moving, but I think it's everyone doing the best effort to move it along with this. And certainly these actions add to the positive view of the reform, and we expect to continue this path.
Perfect. No, thank you, Alejandra. I apologize for the audio issue right there when you started speaking. So just a reminder, the chat function, pose your questions right there and we'll get to them. I want to start by, well, I'll throw up on the screen also what I thought were some key takeaways from yesterday. I think we've covered most of them. I do want to emphasize a point that I think Jason got into and how Sierra Oil and Gas now at the end of round one, given their participation yesterday as well as in the July 15 last year auction, has really established itself as a very interesting player in the new post-reform upstream environment in Mexico. The other thing is, I think, and what I'd like to start the conversation, I sort of have, and maybe it's a glass half full outlook, but I look at some of the positive takeaways, and one of the things I put on the screen here is that Trion, but also the Chevron Intex partnership with Pemex, Trion and that consortia proves, it seems to me, that Pemex maybe isn't such a radioactive partner. What do you think, Alejandra? You're here on the ground and have the much better day-to-day feeling on that. And then maybe Jason, your thoughts.
Well, certainly I joined that group that was very concerned about what could happen with Trion. I was nervous because Trion had a lot of challenges, really. The short time for evaluating the asset and everything very, very in speed. And of course, one of the big uncertainties was, Pemex partnership. How is going to be Pemex as a partner? It's the first time in history that Pemex is going to join as a partner in an E&P project. He has a partnership in a refinery, in
pipelines,
pipeline, something, but as an E&P company. So it's still an uncertainty. I mean, we need to see how it's going to behave. So far, I think they are doing the best for understanding and collaborating in that sense. But I'm glad that at least 4 companies take the risk for prove that, right? So certainly it's a good signpost, but it's still to be seen how it works. But it's going to really set the path for as Jason mentioned, it's really all the business plan, all the new strategy for Pemex is really based significantly on how Pemex could work as a partner. Mm-hmm. So Pemex needs to do it well, I think. It's forced to do it. It's the new strategy, it's the new vision for the company, and it's not only E&P. I think it's also the foundation for downstream and all the activities. So I'm glad to see that companies take the risk and it's not any company. It's important and serious companies who take the risk.
And it's, Jason, I mean, what's your thoughts on that? The point, as we for years talked about opening and reforming the upstream in Mexico, was Pemex didn't have the capabilities, they didn't have the finance, they didn't have the know-how, they weren't exposed to best practices or technology. Well, that sort of seems to be the case now after yesterday, would you think?
I mean, I think it's definitely changing, and I think, this could be a game changer for Pemex. But we'll have, as Alejandro pointed out, we'll have to sort of wait and see how this partnership develops and whether Pemex, can adjust to being a junior partner. Mm-hmm. For 76 years, from the 1938 nationalization until, well, even after the energy reform was passed in late 2013, I mean, Pemex hasn't been in this position. They haven't had to follow orders from anybody else. And, there was a lot of concern. I think there still is some concern as to, whether, Pemex got the memo that it isn't running the ship anymore. And that may have been, perhaps why for Trion, which was an interesting block geologically, had relatively low exploration risk when Pemex had made a discovery there in 2012, despite the very solid geological characteristics, there were only 2 bids for it. I mean, from the government standpoint, they got, 2 bids and they auctioned off and they were good bids. So, that might not be a huge concern to anyone right now. But, I think that there is definitely some sense among companies that maybe, I think some companies might have taken the approach that it was kind of, let's wait and see how Pemex deals with, its first guinea pig, and then, we might, consider something later in a future farm out. So, I think though, as you pointed out, this does have the potential to be a very significant change for Pemex. They will have access to new technology, not just through the Trion farm out, but also as a partner in the block that they won by bidding. So that could really allow them to up their game and develop their own deepwater capabilities, which is certainly a hope that everybody has.
So let's move away from Trion for the moment and Pemex. And there's a question here. I think we've all answered this, but let's put it on the table. There's a two-part question. The first part is what was expected and how did the results meet or exceed expectations? The second part is, or the second question, what about CNOOC's valuations? So Alejandra, why don't we start with you?
Well, I positively surprised about the Chinese companies. Really, they were very aggressive. I think that reflects how positive they feel about the geology there, about the terms and conditions that the government set for the contracts and the bid process itself. So certainly it's a positive signal in terms that the companies are very positive on that. For me, it's a surprise because first it's alone. It's the only company really, well, beyond Statoil in some point, but Pemex itself. But it's a company that bids by itself, and it's kind of weird for these kind of projects and the risk you have here. Mm-hmm. But anyway, it's not the situation forward, right? For me, it's quite aggressive, but it's a good reflection of how positive these companies could be about opportunities in Mexico. And expectations, you said in the first part of the question. Well, I think it's positive, but we need to keep it in the context that it's a deep water, it's exploration project. So, for example, if you are thinking on how it's going to impact the oil production of Mexico, well, it's taking a while. Even Trion, if it is the one producing first, is not going to produce before 2020, right?
I think they said 2023.
Right. I think that they were the time frame got lengthened. Compared to past.
So
but
your point is absolutely right. Yeah.
It's positive, but don't lose the context. I mean, we are happy, we are excited, but of course, this industry is the expectations is taking long. I'm glad, for example, that so many blocks was awarded that bring the possibility for scale in some of the challenges like development infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So for Deepwater, all the blocks were awarded. So that could create synergies for development infrastructure and for improving a lot of the things that used to challenge this kind of development. But it's taking time. I mean, it's positive, could create some synergies in the future, and it's improving some of the risk, but certainly it's taking time.
Yeah, no, I think that's always, the Deepwater are long-term projects. Jason, on the CNOOC bids, the valuation, or just China's participation, any thoughts on that?
I think it's interesting that China, which does not have a long history with Mexico, sort of business ties like you would expect from countries in the U.S. I think that it's interesting that they did choose to jump into Mexico. I mean, the Chinese national oil companies do have a long history of being involved in Latin America, often with more of your left-wing sort of anti-American,
or ideologically
aligned, countries like Venezuela, where obviously they've been propping up Venezuelan PDVSA for a while, but Ecuador as well. But I think more than anything, it just seems to me to be a recognition of the fact that Mexico is an attractive place to invest. A lot of companies from numerous different countries invest in this round. So I don't think it's particularly unusual that the Chinese would be looking at the same resource base and the same conditions and think that this was an interesting place to go. One thing that I think is interesting and sort of goes to your point and goes to the question about the valuations, the added royalties that the bidders made. I mean, you do see, interestingly, that from CNOOC, but also from the Petronas Sierra bid that won, for example, in the Block 4 in the Salina Basin, you do tend to see higher levels of additional royalties there, which I think probably just reflects the fact that they're not beholden to shareholders, that they're either a national oil companies, majority or entirely owned by the state. They can kind of do what they want. So I think that's interesting.
You're right. I mean, because as it unfolded yesterday, the first half with the Perdido blocks, we all were literally the crowd was oohing and awing when the CNOOC royalties were announced. So then when later in the Salina Basin, when there was even larger additional royalty numbers put on the table, it was quite remarkable because people had already been blown away by the CNOOC. Final question. Yeah.
I was going to say, but then again, I mean, you look at some of the private companies, or the publicly traded companies, not NOCs that bid, for example, in Block 5 in the Salina Basin, which was sort of the star of the auction that got 4 bids, more than any other block. Anadarko and Shell, which came in number 2, I mean, they offered over 19% in additional royalties.
And the minimum was 1.9%.
So, it's not
10 times.
Just the NOCs that are doing that, certainly.
It's really a positive valuation in general for the geology and contracts and terms in Mexico.
A final thought. I'm curious because you said this about CNOOC being by itself. Do you think they tried to partner? Do you think they approached Pemex? Do you think they tried to be part of a consortium, or do you think they always intended to go in as a sole operator in this auction?
Well, if I say they tried, because that's my first impression, it's like why nobody wants to partner with them. But it's not. I mean, I cannot affirm
that was an unfair question, sorry.
Yeah.
All right, Jason, you want to answer that one?
I mean, my logic says that any player going for Deepwater try to make partnerships because the risks are huge, and you want to share the financial risk, and so it's the capital you need to put in front is huge. So certainly any company is not a label for CNO or a Chinese company or ISC or American company. No, I mean any company in Deepwater, I was expecting they tried to partnership for these kind of opportunities. So I'm surprised. I'm really surprised that CN go alone, as Pemex go alone for one bid. I mean, the same surprise for me, for any of those.
And in fact, there's a question about that. There's several questions about logistics I want to get back to, but you just mentioned something somebody asked specifically, and what the impressions of that bid by Pemex in Block 1 of Perdido. Alejandra?
Synergies for Trion. And I think Jason mentioned a little bit or briefly about, the opportunity, the contract that the CNH made is giving you the opportunity to sell quite easily. If you are not really you can sell up to the, I think, 70% really. So you keep operating with the 30%, and I think it's always another vision about business opportunities. If you can have this block with a good synergies with Trion, and if you're success in one, and you could add value to that block in the future.
I mean, maybe one thing that Pemex was thinking, and this is sort of speculation, but it would seem to make sense, is that if Pemex had won that, I mean, they offered a relatively low bid. Had they won that block, then, perhaps they could have then, as Alejandra suggested, turn around at a later date and sell, a stake in that block off to their partner in Trion, because, the block itself sort of straddles Trion. Trion sort of sat in the middle of it. So you could basically kind of combine those two areas into one project, and then Pemex could get a cash infusion from selling that off. So that's one, possibility that may have lay behind that logic.
All right, let's move. Thank you. Wow, thanks to everyone for all your questions. We'll do our best to get to everything here. Let's take some. There's a question here about logistics, and it says, "What are you guys hearing as to where these developments will be serviced from? Matamoros, Campeche, perhaps U.S. bases. Also, operationally speaking, how significantly do you see the potential work programs impacting helping out stalled service businesses? So what's the employment? And I did see that the Minister of Energy, Pedro Joaquin Colwell, noted there will be 450,000 new jobs created. So just as that caveat, what's the impact here? Especially like this is an interesting point about the stalled service business. We're all hearing about all the people out of work in the service businesses.
Yeah, I think it's, again, taking into context that it's long-term view, we still need to see what happened with the explorations work. But operations, in my opinion, could be easily right now from U.S., really. But once you find something or you declare commerciality of some of the blocks, it may be more sense to develop really the good infrastructure up to Mexico, maybe in Tampico or something. But I mean, we are still very early to see that. And of course, from the government point of view, that's what you want, to create the jobs and the investment inside the country. And that could be very positive. I cannot say any estimation of employee creation or something at this point, but of course, it's something that you want. Now, even if you operate from U.S., I think Mexico is still capture a lot of those benefits, because how the fiscal terms are set is anyone that works in Mexico for certain periods, they pay taxes in Mexico. So certainly it's still benefit for Mexico as a country and into the economy of this country. It's taking long. I mean, for the exploratory period, we cannot expect really a huge multiplier effect, but certainly it's creating conditions and opportunities for business for the future, for service companies and even for communications, and you know, it's a lot of ways you can capture the benefits of these kind of projects.
And I agree completely with Alejandra. I think it's probably more of a medium to long-term benefit than in the short term. I mean, in the short term, as Alejandra said, certainly for the Perdido blocks, I think a lot of that, you know, the plan is to sort of source it from Texas or in the U.S. Gulf Coast, because it's very, very close. Obviously, you know, to service new work in the Salina Basin, it's you know, in the southern Gulf, so that would be presumably serviced from, you know, Campeche. Or, you know, Tabasco or somewhere in there. But, you know, I think that there is definitely, you know, going to be a small scope for, you know, short-term, you know, boosts to Mexico's supply sector. I mean, you're talking about, for a lot of these blocks, you know, maybe drilling one well during the exploratory period. There's not going to be a particular boom in the industry just for the foreseeable future. Now, you know, granted, Pemex, the chief executive of Pemex, Gonzalo Zanaya, did say yesterday that he expects investment to be flowing into the Peñon farm out, you know, starting immediately upon the contract signing early next year. You know, so that, you know, will provide certainly a little bit of a boost. The fact that Pemex is going to get some money, you know, will be helpful, you know, certainly to ensure that it can pay its own suppliers for other projects. But, you know, I agree that there isn't likely to be, you know, a major change imminently.
I want to come back to something you're hinting at, but because I think one of the things that's coming out of these two answers gets to, we're all celebrating the success, and we're using the metric of, you know, that Trion was tendered successfully, 8 out of 10 blocks were tendered. So we're all using the metric of how many blocks were it successfully, and rightfully so. I mean, because of all the coyuntura, you know. But there's something I think let's come back to if you have time later is, how do you actually define success in a more medium long term? We just talked a lot about jobs, but there's also the production question. There's the income for the Mexican government. But we'll hold that for now. Let me go to something here that I'm going to read this verbatim, because it gets into some of the longer term outlook. Is it possible that one reason there generally weren't more than 1 or 2 companies vying for any given block is because of fear of lower oil prices? That is, that oil prices may not hold up if shale producers' plans for activity next year kicks in, and as a result there will be a slew of more shale output that may drag down prices and hurt frontier exploration offshore. And it might make the price too low for too long a period of time. So
there's a lot in that, but Alejandra,
Yeah.
I think you understand the question.
Certainly. I mean, one of the key risks for Deepwater before the auction was, with the current market situation, and it's not just for now and next year. It's as the question say, if the situation is extended for longer term, maybe not the 40s price, but yes, something below 70s, right? There are very good foundations for that kind of assumptions, and I think this industry is how they solve it is always with gains in efficiency, of course innovation, and it's always finding the best way to produce. I mean, it's we calculate a couple of break-even prices in our previous exercise for this bid round, and we, depending on development concept and assuming different cost reactions and how all the service industry react also for more activity, less activity. Well, you can go from break-even prices from 50, 54 to up to 80s or close to 100. It depends on really how you assume your development concept, how you assume all the service industry develop and is able to really diminish costs in this kind of projects. And you cannot really assume like whatever is today is going to remain for the long term. And we are talking about 25, 30 years at least. So certainly you need to assume some gains on efficiency and technology, innovation, etc. And I think the bet these companies does in the bid yesterday is demonstrating that they feel comfortable to be able to make money in this kind of fields. I mean, at the very end is what it needs to be,
Yeah.
right? It needs to be profitable. If not, they simply relinquish the area and that's all, right?
Jason, you have any thoughts on this price question? And especially this part about if shale production in the U.S. kicks in.
I think that's definitely, a concern for the industry as a whole. I think it's a bit difficult to kind of get into. I'm not privy to the, internal decision-making process of the oil companies, but I agree with Alejandra, the fact that you have numerous oil companies that, seem to think that this area, that these deepwater opportunities can be profitable. I think that suggests a reasonable degree of confidence. And also, I think it's important to keep in mind that we're talking about very lengthy production horizons.
Right.
So, it's always somewhat of a leap of faith when oil companies make decisions to invest, particularly for projects in deepwater where you're talking about, very long lead times and then talking about project lifespan that could go up to, with extensions and everything, we're talking about 50 years.
50 years, right.
So, I think when I speak with oil companies about their decision-making process, the repeated claim that I hear back is that, they recognize this is a very long-term horizon, and so they're not making decisions based on short-term price fluctuations.
Yeah, they're looking for historical, and like Alejandra talked about, looking at some of the break-even, which no one really wants to tell you what their break-even model is, but...
Until such time as then there's a major price collapse, and then, they just start slashing everything in their investment budget, despite, repeated assurances that they don't look at short-term price movements. So,
yeah.
But,
But I think when you evaluate any kind of E&P project, you start, of course, with the geological risk. So if you really look into the materiality you are looking for, depending on the kind of company you are. So in this situation, these major companies, these huge national companies are looking really for reserves or resources more than 400 million, right? So they are looking for huge materiality. So the first risk about geology risk is you need to check in that. Then you start looking into the terms conditions for contracts, if they are favorable enough for this kind of development, the legal risk to get out or to get in with other partners, to sell, etc. So all that is the second risk point. And then you totally contrast with what you think could be the market situation in general, because it's not just the price, it's also if you are going to have a market to sell these, right?
Good point.
So I think any kind of a project you evaluate in different levels, And I think if you put this first bid, it's because you check in first in the geology, that is really positive, and then in the contract and the bid process itself, and the legal situation in general for Mexico, right? So that's positive. Then if you don't really find something that brings you this materiality, or after the first exploratory period, you say, no, this is more costly than what I expected, etc. Because it's basically a new frontier, especially in Salinas.
Yeah.
So
the government did a really good job of striking that balance between the materiality and the fiscal terms, and it seems like in this process, I mean, one thing I've heard a lot, I don't know if you guys heard the same, is how open to feedback during the contract development process in this bidding that they were, in terms of, obviously they weren't trying to give away the house, but they wanted to make sure that these were in alignment, to your point, the geology, the materiality with the fiscal terms. Jason?
No, I think that that's very true. The government recognized from the beginning that this entire process would only be successful if they carried it out in conjunction with oil companies, because at the end of the day, they need to attract the oil companies to come in and invest if they want to boost production and ensure the necessary flow of oil revenues into their government coffers. And I think after the first auction in July of last year, which went not particularly well.
2 out of 15, that with the,
Yeah. And, the government really realized that it needed to make changes. And to its credit, it went back to oil company concerns and really did, change a lot of the issues that were giving problems, both in terms of, trying to bring, the draft contract terms and bidding rules more into line with international standards. But even changing the way the auction mechanism was drafted. So, in the first instance, in the first auction of last July, there were several cases in the finance ministry, which sets the minimum bidding variables,
right,
did not publicize those variables before the auction, with the apparent hope that by not telling companies, that would encourage companies to bid more so that they, would, go over the minimum. What actually happened is you had a few instances in which companies bid just below the finance ministry's minimum, would have been open to bidding more, but didn't know it, so the blocks ended up not being awarded. And just with that tweak...
That was Statoil was one of them, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
And just with that tweak, you remove that problem, and then that helped ensure, a continuing improvement in the results. So I agree that the government has really gone out of its way to partner with oil companies to ensure that this process could work for both sides, and that's very important. One thing that I just wanted to mention, Alejandra made, I think, a very important point about the materiality of the blocks on offer, the materiality of Mexico's Deepwater. And I think that that's something that should be addressed. You've got a strange situation where Mexico and Pemex have been producing huge amounts of oil for quite some time, but the Deepwater has been largely untouched. Pemex, for a very, very long time, for decades, just had a lot of easily extractable oil from shallow water fields, from Cantarell. It never had a need to go into the deep water until very recently. And so, you contrast the situation in the U.S., where there is huge production in U.S. Gulf deep water, lots and lots of wells. I think Pemex has drilled all of a dozen wells in Mexican deep water ever. So, you have a sense that there is a huge geological potential here, and the Perdido Fault Belt in the U.S., the formation is producing quite a lot. It doesn't just stop at the imaginary line in the Gulf. So, you have that. You've also got, really prolific shallow water areas in Mexico, and then this deep water space in Mexican waters is just kind of virgin territory. So I think that a lot of companies find Mexico an attractive place to invest, because it's really the only place in the world that you have material resources with this potential in an area that has really almost never been touched.
Yeah, no, I think these are all, and this is all part of the whole reform process. I mean, the crown jewels, or whatever the terminology you want to use, was interesting, but to your point, we really didn't know for sure. I mean, everyone was guessing, so now we'll find out for sure. The subtitle of our discussion this morning had the word institutions in it. Let's talk a little bit about that, and I encourage folks to continue to pose your questions online here through the platform, the webinar platform. But I want to ask both of you a little bit about institutions, because some of the most critical pieces here have obviously been CNH, but now the ASEA, which is the safety and security regulator that was stood up last year as part of the reform. Obviously, the CRE has a role in some elements, not so much of what happened so far, but as one of the regulators of the sector in Mexico. How can Mexico continue to consolidate and make sure that the energy authorities and the institutions, I mean, SENER is included in that as a policymaker, how can the institutions continue to be optimized and help the continuity of the reform and this longer-term success we hope for?
I take it first. Okay. Certainly, one of the amazing things about this energy reform in general is the speed the government is implementing all this. So we are talking here just for a little piece. There is the EMP, but the whole energy is just so challenging to implement in this speed that I'm positive about how institutions are developed. CNH is building capabilities really fast, hiring a lot of people, trying to find out the best software solutions for handling and making easy for all the companies to provide information and to really comply with all the obligations that the regulation set. It's not perfect. It's still under construction, but they are really doing the best, and I'm still amazing about how fast they are moving on that. Environment and security, the regulation there is one of the missing pieces, the big missing pieces.
And ASEA that's in charge.
And there is ASEA in charge. Of course, we have certain things coming from Pemex itself, with standards and things. We have certain things coming from Semarnat before, from CNH. So it was a puzzle. It was really messy and incomplete, really. So ASEA is moving forward. They are almost done with the regulations for EMP industry. They are really moving in a fast path for posting all the environmental and security regulations for all the chain, the value chain, so transportation and storage and everything. But they are almost done with the EMP part of this regulation. That is very helpful. But I also need to thank for all the companies that are taking the risk to get into this sector, even with all those holes. Right, that they really trust in this government. I mean, it was really they feel confident that they recognize there is a lot of missing pieces. There is a lot of uncertainty when you move into environment with holes in regulations, but they trust in that, and they saw that the government is willing to fill in that in the best intentions of this.
That's a fantastic point, because the uncertainty is the most evil word in the private investment. Whatever it's energy or whatever business you're in, uncertainty is not what you want to hear when you propose the project. Jason, following up on that question, to your mind, do CNH and ASEA have the budget and opportunity to build staff and capabilities to deal and manage and regulate what now is going to be an incredibly dynamic upstream environment?
I think they're building that. I know this is really more familiar with CNH, but I know that CNH was set up to be self-funding, and that is continuing. And they're certainly, they've been able, as Alejandra pointed out, they've been quite successful at growing their capacity and handling the workload to date. Obviously, as Pemex or as Mexico continues to auction off more blocks, and you have more contracts and different types of contracts that need to be administered, that could be an issue, going forward if they have the resources. But certainly so far, they've really, gotten up and running very, very quickly, and they've really adapted quite well to their new role. So I don't see that being a problem going forward. I also think that certainly this government has shown that putting this energy reform together and making it a success is the priority. And so if there were financing issues for those institutions, I think that they would address that
Yeah.
you know, if necessary. But so far, I haven't seen any sense that is becoming a problem.
You know, the Calderon energy reform of 2008 was belittled in many ways, rightly so. But the one thing that I always remind people is it created the National Hydrocarbons Commission, and so it didn't create it with a great vision, but it created the institution and gave it at least a little bit of a leg up when this major reform came about and allowed it to really become an upstream regulator. So there's a couple of great questions here. One we haven't talked about at all, and in fact, I think is the question of local Mexican supply or local content. The question is, are there requirements that the successful bidders from yesterday use a certain minimum percentage of Mexican supply? So the local content question. Alejandra?
I think for Deepwater is very reasonable because we haven't had an industry for Deepwater. I mean, the suppliers in Mexico are more likely for shallow waters and for onshore projects. So certainly we don't have the service suppliers enough for Deepwater needs. So that's why I think since the beginning it was very reasonable to set a very low local content for these kind of projects. Development, the service and all the infrastructure you need for supplying the Deepwater project is not easy, it's not from one day to other. But that I think is that Mexico has a philosophy, general philosophy in terms of economic development since the 80s, is really, we don't need to do everything locally.
Yeah.
We are a very open country with we really develop the economic policy in terms of free trade, in terms of recognizing that a lot of industries have the value chain is really interconnected internationally. So, and E&P industry is not the exception. I mean, it wouldn't be a big mistake to try to assume we are going to do everything in-house. That is not how the industry works.
Right.
So it's just adding cost if you try to do that, and we have the Brazil example for that.
Right.
And it's not really what Mexico really wants as an economic policy in general.
And I think that's exactly the case. I mean, to use Alejandra's point of the Brazil example as sort of a model of what not to do, I think that when the Mexican government was designing this reform and looking at how to set its own local content policies, they did look at the Brazilian example and say, let's not do that, because that hasn't worked out. And they've gone the other way. They've set local content rules in the Deepwater that are extremely accessible, starting at 3% during the exploration phase and rising to 10%, later once things move into production. And that's incredibly easy for companies to meet because Mexico does have a very developed service sector already in place. So, in all of my discussions with oil companies over the past, 2 years of this process in terms of the Deepwater, or even since the reform was put into place, nobody has ever brought up local content as an issue of concern.
And the percentage on the Deepwater was considerably lower, right, from the get-go compared to the other blocks, right, other auctions, right? What's the percentage? Do you guys
the other auction?
No, from yesterday.
From yesterday, starting in 3?
It starts at 3% during the initial exploration period, and then it rises up to, I think, 10% is the maximum set for the production phase. So, very reasonable, very, very non-controversial.
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, we're running out of time. I mean, we could talk all morning, but we need to end at 12 here. I wanted to, there's several more questions. Let me get to one of these, but I do have one more slide because I want to look a little bit forward and not just continue to take stock, but actually start to look a little bit forward. An interesting question here about bidding patterns. Were there any specific bidding patterns that you noticed yesterday? Most desired blocks were in a certain area, certain water depth. Any patterns?
Really, no. I think the only one that I can say is companies interested in Perdido are completely different from the companies interested in Salinas. I think it's the only really path that we can identify there. well, only the Block 5 in the Salinas has really very competitive in the terms of receiving four bids.
Right.
So, but the rest is, most of them was only one bid.
Yeah. And in a lot of cases, right, there was just
So that doesn't say, every company or consortium evaluate differently.
Yeah, for sure. Jason?
No, I agree. It was sort of striking that there didn't seem to be a discernible pattern in terms of what companies were bidding on, different blocks, different percentages of additional royalties being offered, and it did seem to sort of be, you open the box and you were never sure what you were going to get.
Yeah, just when we thought CNOOC was going to gobble up the entire Perdido fold, they didn't. I mean, they got 2 out of 4, but I guess that was the only close to the Statoil BP. They were obviously the Statoil BP Total, consortium was obviously very aggressive on the Salina Basin. If I remember correctly, they didn't bid at all in Perdido and put 3 bids on the table in Salina Basin. So,
they were moderate bids. I mean, they weren't, particularly
aggressive in submission of number of bids. Yeah. Let's just quickly let's look a little bit forward before we wrap up here. We got about 3 or 4 minutes. They've already launched round 2. They being the Mexican government. Round 2 has been launched. The first auction is scheduled for March 2017. 15 shallow water blocks in the Gulf of Mexico. It may at some point include additional farm-out opportunities. That's what we're hearing as part of the round 2 auction. Production sharing contracts, local content requirements between 15 to 35%. Those are for the basics. Any thoughts on round 2 going into 2017?
Well, so far it looks like there is not a lot of interest on those round 2, but it's still early. Give it a chance. But one of the opinions I think is that it's a lot of processing in the very short time frame. So companies the decision taking inside companies is taking longer than how fast is moving the government. Of course, something interesting is that each round is for different kind of companies.
Correct.
So companies that was very concentrated on Deepwater bids are not the ones that are likely to go in the 2.2, for example, right? So it's different kind of companies. So, but anyway, I think the timing issue is one of the problems. The other is, of course, small companies. For example, if you already take 1 or 2 blocks, you are happy with that, and it's what you can handle. And so maybe you are not going to run for another round in a while. But let's see. I mean, it's still time for look into the interest.
And I think it's interesting that, I think one important element of the auction yesterday is that it's giving the government a lot more confidence to pursue aggressive, future auctions. They have planned, they've stated plans always to have 1 auction a year, multiple phases. But there have, as we've seen, there's been sort of a little bit of nervousness on the part of the government for some of these more ambitious areas. We saw it with Deepwater that they wanted to make sure that everything was organized properly and kind of let, the time frame for the Deepwater auction slid, for a while as they tried to make it work properly. They've postponed any plans to offer a shale or a conventional auction because of the current price situation. I think, and then farm-outs, clearly, the additional farm-outs have been sort of just stuck in a morass of delay for quite some time. And I think that the solid result yesterday really is going to give the government greater incentive, greater confidence to push forward with some of those things that might be a bit more daring. And we saw this in the press conference that was held after the results came in yesterday afternoon, where the Energy Secretary, Pedro Joaquin Caldwell, said that in addition to the 3 auctions that they've already announced for next year, they are now planning 3 additional auctions before the end of Peña Nieto's term at the end of 2018. And he said specifically that would probably include more Deepwater acreage and very probably would include shale for the first time. So, that suggests that the government now feels that it has, everything lined up in the way that it needs to be, and so, full speed ahead.
It's an interesting. I mean, the one thing I'm curious to see is there was supposed to be around 1.5 auction 1.5, which would have been shale unconventional. That looks like it's getting kicked over to round 2. I think we're all wondering if that will actually take place in round 2 or not. I guess stay tuned. We're out of time, but I wanted to give you each the opportunity to make some final comments. But before I do, I'm going to shamelessly plug an Institute of the Americas and Inter-American Dialogue program next Tuesday in Washington, D.C. Join us there for more of this kind of discussion, but a little bit more focused on the political transition in the United States and what it means for Latin America. But Alejandra, Leon, any final thoughts? I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here, and thank you so much.
Well, I just want to thank you, Jeremy, Jason, for this very nice conversation, and of course I'm available for any further questions. I'm glad to share. Nobody really has the truth in this kind about what is going to happen in 2020 or 2025, etc. But it's always, I'm happy to interchange always our opinions and analysis.
Thank you. Yeah, if anyone wants to know the price of oil when Trion starts producing in 2023, they should direct that to Jason, I believe. Right. Okay. Jason.
No, again, like Alejandra said, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. It's a very interesting time to be in Mexico watching the oil sector. I guess just one final thought, just to sort of go a bit into shale. I think shale will be an interesting thing to watch going forward. Just a few weeks ago, maybe a month or so ago, the CNH disclosed that Pemex, which had requested a shale offer a drilling permit, actually just said, guys, can we just cancel that because we don't have the regulations that we need in order to drill that well, so it's pointless to have the permit. And so I think that, going back to the institutions, exactly. Mm-hmm. That does seem to be an issue that is hanging, and so it needs to be addressed in order to do the shale auction that the Energy Secretary suggested will be coming imminently. So, I think that they watch this space. So it'll be interesting to see how they actually put those rules in place to be able to move forward there.
No pressure if anyone is out there listening from ASEA. No pressure, Mr. De Regulis and staff. Well, my final thought is congratulations to the Mexican government. There's so many people who've worked so hard for so many years, one of whom unfortunately is no longer with us. Rest in peace, Edgar Angel. But congratulations to the Mexican government. We'll step back in 10 or 15 years and have different metrics to define success. But I can say on December 6th, that was a huge success yesterday. So congratulations, Godspeed. We'll see you all next week in Washington or online or in person. Thank you again, Jason Fargo and Alejandra Leon. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.